have systems, not just systems on ground, but also institutional and policy frameworks which are resilient enough to support women when disaster strikes. Today, our session, we are very grateful for FCTO and the program to be sponsoring this at SDPI for a lot of hard work adding to the data and the review work that has gone into this work. And we're also very extremely grateful to the ownership that we see from different various government organizations who are represented on stage today. A very special thanks to Ms. Rubina Khurshid Alam, who is the Minister of State and Assembly on SDGs. So thank you so much, Madam, for joining us and taking up time. This shows the commitment of the government to this work that we are doing with the SDPI. We also have Ms. Nafai Nahiyat, who is the FCTO representative for the Remit program and the senior responsible officer for Remit. We have with us Mr. Khwaja Imran Raza, who is the Secretary of the National Commission of the Status of Women. Thank you, sir, for joining us. We have Mr. Bilal Anwar, who is the CEO of RMF, the National Disaster Risk Management Fund. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. And we have Mr. Waqar Ahmed, who is the Executive Director of SDPI, Joint Executive Director of SDPI, who has been a constant pillar of support for us. And a lot of appreciation for the work that Dr. Farihah Rahman, who is the Research Fellow at Center of Evidence Action and Research at SDPI, for this gender policy review that we have been conducting for the last few months. Just to tell you that this is not the first, this is just one of the workshops that we are having. We are working simultaneously with the State Bank, with the Board of Investment. So it's like looking at gender policy and climate action work and supporting women's work as a whole of government approach rather than just picking specific issues. So this is just one of the series of the workshops, and we'll be conducting more, we'll be inviting more. And before I move to our introductory remarks by the FCTO representative, I just want to add one thing that the most important people who are for us are the experts who joined us today. And you have taken out time for about 2 hours on a morning, which can be a very busy work morning for all of you, to guide us how we take this work forward. So thank you all for that as well. Now I would like to invite Ms. Nafai Nahiyat for her introductory remarks. Who is the SRO for Remit and FCTO representative.
Very much alive, and thank you everyone for joining us today. On behalf of British High Commission and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development of Pakistan, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to all of you, the government counterparts which are sitting here, Ms. Rubina Khurshid, for joining us. I know that your time is very busy and important, and the fact that you are here proves the fact that gender is a priority and climate is a priority for all of you. And today's event is interesting for us in FCTO because gender and climate are the topmost priorities for us. The steer that we get from our headquarters is to prioritize these in our programming, both design and delivery. And today's events give us this unique opportunity to prioritize both of these things simultaneously. I also want to say thanks to Adam Smith International and Sustainable Development Policy Institute for organizing this event and bringing this very important agenda and bringing all the researchers and academia and government counterparts under one roof to make some important movement in this direction. I lead on a program which is called Revenue Mobilization Investment and Trade Program. As the name would tell you, it's a macroeconomic governance reform program aimed at revenue mobilization movement, removal of investment climate challenges and constraints, and improving Pakistan's trade competitiveness. And gender cuts across all its 4 themes as a top priority for us. And after last year's floods, the program has pivoted heavily towards climate response. So as part of this initiative or a general steer for the program, what we have been doing with the government of Pakistan past few months is that we have offered them support in reviewing their policies which focus on gender, and focusing on gender framework is a one step in that direction. And the team is going to present to you a 5-pillar agenda that needs to be added to the gender framework. They will do that in a bit. I also want to reassure you that our support is not going to end at the review stage. It will continue at the planning and implementation stage as well. And as we move forward, you must have known that the British government and FCDO has gone financial constraints during the past year, but this year is more comfortable in terms of finances as well as certainty around finances. So we can plan that better, and this is exactly what we plan to do. And this is what we want to extract out of today's discussion, that we want to have some implementation plan in our hands where we can support the government of Pakistan in pursuing its gender agenda generally, and gender and climate resilience more specifically. I just want to end to say specific thanks to all our government counterparts, including NDRFF, Ministry of Planning, NCSW, Madam Rabina Khurshid once again for sparing time for us. And I hope that this will develop a strategic partnership for innovative solutions for a more resilient and inclusive Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you for the carried forward this very important work and fight on that action. Now, if I may invite our keynote speaker, Ms. Rabina Khurshid, Minister of State and SCPN on SDGs for the keynote address.
Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Special regards to Mr. Bilal Anwar, Mr. Khwaja Imran, Mr. Muhammad Ali Kamal, and then Dr. Bakar, and then I have Dr. Fariha and post British High Commission and all the dignitaries who are sitting over here. And if someone is online as well, so my special regards to all of you. When it comes to SDPI, first, before coming to that thing, I would really want to say that over here, because you have covered all the aspects, like the government of the different sectors of the government is also here, like different ministries or different departments from the government side are there. But I am talking about the SDGs, or specifically talking about this agenda or this issue. I would like to say that this is something from the SDGs task force of the parliament, which comes the part of the parliament. So when we want to see something get implemented, that is, of course, can be done through the parliament. So we by taking that pride that has been the media along with my team, and of course, very delightfully and very proudly, and thank to SDPI as well, because at every step, if one they are our collaborative partners as well in the SDGs task force of the parliament. And other than that, it's been now a long relation of mine with the SDPI. That's like more than now years. So it's something when it comes to SDPI, no matter where I am, what it is, I would always want to be a part, because I believe that this is a place where we really looking forward not only the research thing, but we can do the things and we can work as a team. And then a person like me, because as being a parliamentarian, most of the time you need to have the research, you need to have the data, you need to have the expertise, because that is somehow, because unfortunately Pakistan, our member of the parliament, they have this issue, we don't get that support staff system. So in that situation, when it comes to these renowned sort of think tanks, I think they play a very pivotal role. They not only we can get the expertise, we can work along with each other. Now getting back to the subject, which is of course something which is very important. When we talk, I believe the gender is something which we are talking from not now. It's something which has been discussed now. It's been discussed from years and years and years. But my question, I'm sorry for little bit blunt, because I, as Meena Kushidar, it's not being only the parliamentarian, I myself are being a part of the civil society, and I believe that the civil society is something which can play a great role of like eyes and brains too. So I believe that something when we talk about from like, if I say this is my second term in the parliament, from last 10 years, I'm listening of course a lot about the gender equality, gender policy, from here to there, there to there. But why we are not getting that success, that is also one of a very big question. So in that way, I would really, a few things which in the end I would, for the way forward, I would like to suggest, or on which as being the convener, I will try to talk about those things. One of the things, and then when we talk specifically, when we're talking about the disaster management, with resilience or risk reduction or these sort of things, I believe that now the climate change issue is not only the climate change. It's now the most important thing, human rights. It's the rights, and the most vulnerable person who suffered in this, like as we have seen in the example in the difference, specifically when it comes to the floods, we have seen the most vulnerable was who? That was women, that was the children. And when in the COP as well, being a part of the COP, I specifically said over there in the different forums of the UN as well, that we need, when we talk about the losses and damages, when we are talking about these issues, we need to focus not only that we the losses and damages are of the money related. They are moreover to other things as well. They are moreover to those, like the missing component is when they are getting the data. In that data, the most missing thing is like how many number of the women, how many number of the children, what they were suffering from, and then afterwards the trauma which they have been through. But anyways, that for that thing, like when we specifically talk about Pakistan. Pakistan is a blessed country, of course, no matter what we all survive or suffer. But I think now categorically, when we, because most of the people they are working, wherever we go, nowadays everybody is telling that they're working on the climate change, they're working on the gender, they're working on this subject or most of the same of the work. But the things are very much scattered. So from SDG's parliamentary task force, we try to gather almost all the stakeholders. And we want them and we requested them to work collaboratively, to bring every work under one roof. And specifically, I would really like to congratulate the Planning Development Ministry yesterday. Yesterday, they had started for the review report and to come up with get the solutions and the way forward, that how we can achieve the goals and how we can make the things more easier, how we can get out over from the poverty or these sort of all the issues which is related to that. But when again, specifically because of course this is subject to gender, I believe the woman is the one when we talk about the gender equality. Because nowadays, in this world as well, I'm sure the number of women is much more rather than the man. So it is, when we're talking about the work, any work, it's about now the things that go towards gender equality. The opportunities, who's working on what. But moreover, the thing is that the people who are working, the people who are talking about the policy, specifically my target is going to be the policy. For that, I think not only the research of matter, I think we need to engage more, which I've done with the passage of time, that we need to engage the stakeholders, those people as well who are being the sufferers. We can take the examples of like what sort of the challenges going through again and again, because most of the time, as being a very humble and a very, God bless you all, that all are experts over here. I'm not that expert, but in my humble capacity, what I came across to know that mostly we do, of course, take the consultants are there, the experts are there, but I think it is very much needed to take the examples, and by taking those examples to get the way forward, and to make the people sit over those, for the people whom we are working, that what they want, what they feel, how they want the way. Because most of the time, we have been provided by the solutions, but somehow those solutions or those policies, they wouldn't work for us in that way. We want those things to get implemented. So for that, I would really request that our forum of the SDGs task force, SDGs, and of course, British High Commission is also very there, and I'm really grateful for being so thoughtful and for working and supporting and thinking for the mankind. That's the great gesture. But again, I would request that it's very important that we need to engage in a right way. We don't need to scatter the things, like those who are working, we need to bring on one board so things will not get everywhere in different pockets. The good things should be done together. And then of course the data, that is the huge problem of ours, that we couldn't get through with the data. And then the ownership, because mostly yesterday as well in one meeting, I was going through with different civil society people, and development sector was also there. And unfortunately, I don't know why we don't want to share our knowledge with each other. Like there is a word which usually from last 10 years, I'm just listening that when I met someone, they said that, hum capacity building karna chahte hain. I hope that, are there some orders or I can go? There are, okay, but okay. So, mostly like they don't want to share the knowledge. And from last 10 years, I've been a member of parliament. Most of the time when I go to some conference or event, what they came across, like what I came across to know that, we want to do the capacity building. We want to do the capacity building. I think now it's changed. Now we have to change the language of our as well, that we can say that we would love to share the knowledge with each other. Because when we say this word that we want to share the knowledge, so there it comes that if we are sharing, we would love to learn from each other. So when this thing, I think we are going to go in that level, I think things will become more easier. And then of course the discussion with not only with the stakeholders, then with those vulnerable who are being suffered, or from there we came across to this idea that okay, we need to come up with a gender policy. And another thing, I really request to these to all of those experts, civil society, development partners, or those who are sitting over there, that so much being invested on this specific subject or any subject whichever has been given to the different forums. I just wanted to always I would request, and I always, wherever nowadays I get any opportunity, I do ask them that why don't we do evaluation of our own as well? That if something has been invested, like from 5 years or 3 years, some project was being given. So what was the outcome of that? How many number of people who got success, or they being the beneficiaries of that? Or was that policy or that dialogues or that program was in the benefit? Like, कितने लोगों ने उससे कुछ फायदा उठाया? What is the pilot, or maybe success, or maybe not the success? Because this is very important. Because we just जैसे कहते हैं आगा दौड़ पीछा छोड़ करके, we just love to walk, and But I think it's very important. So we can learn from our missing components, and this we have tried to learn. Like I've joined the SDG Secretariat on the 2nd of June last year, and in these 10 to 11 months, what I've done, that we got a good number of success. But why? Because we keep on doing our evaluation, And the last, I would, to be very realistic and honestly, like this month, my 3 of the staff members, they are getting their training. They've been appointed because we believe in the institutional mandate. Before that, I didn't have that staff, and then specifically, this is whatever from the parliament side I'm doing as a volunteer job. Like I'm not getting any perks or privileges because I just wanted to. Mostly लोग के ज़हन में आता है कि शायद बड़ा आसान होता है स्टेज की इस तरफ खड़े होके कह देना कि ये यूं कर ले. But this, why I'm saying this all, because I just wanted to share with you that what I'm doing with my own passion, with all of my own willingness to get these things to be done. Because as being climate change activist, I have gone through with so many, like I've worked as a mystery shopper as well. For my own legislative piece of work with SDPI, once we came up with one legislative business we wanted to bring, and for that, their people were also on the ground, and I went by myself as well in the slums, where I went like as a mystery shopper, and I think that's very important, because when we want to achieve something, we have to go towards that level of that cause. And then I think we can get further solutions. And just in the end, last but not the least, I would really like to request, and especially in the way forward as well, that from the SDGs Forum of the Parliament, we came up with this consortium we are talking about for the Asia Pacific region. Because when we're talking about the issues, when we're talking about this is now no more of one country issue. Because if something is happening in Pakistan, it's not going to stay in Pakistan. It definitely goes to different other countries as well. The other countries are going to suffer as well. If something is happening, like if you talk about the SAARC country, most of the SAARC countries' issues are the same. The poverty, the weather, the smog, these things are the same. So we cannot mix the apples with the oranges. And this is also the thing which I mentioned again and again in the COP as well. And then in the Pakistan Parliament, once we had the IPO regional seminar in the Parliament first ever time, and that as well, I tried to hammer. In fact, I would. It's great, so apologies, I use this word, that I try to hammer again and again that we need to come up with a consortium. Because most of the time, because we're talking about the disaster as well, most of the time when some disaster happen in any country, everybody is of course open their hearts and they love to share their donations, they love to share their charity or help towards the country. But then again, the resources are being wasted. Because they don't have the specific data that at which place, how many number of people are there, how many number of women are there, how many number of children are there. So because we are lacking behind of that data, so mostly the resources are being wasted. So for that, when we are talking about for that consortium, and SDPI is helping the parliamentary task force specifically in that, in which we are trying to create this region, Asia region, in which we are talking about that it's not important that for this we need to have a proper office, because now everything is on Zoom. So one can do it and then we can share our data. So we are working on that as well. And of course, when we talk about the gender, so most of the goals, of course, I always say that these are my goals, because when we talk about SDGs, mostly people think that it's maybe it's a foreign agenda or UN agenda, but I believe there is nothing bigger than the SDGs agenda. And these are my SDGs goals, these are your goals, because this covers all. It covers climate change, gender equality, what not it comes under it. And there are small steps if we take the proper guidance, proper way, and proper support, and supporting each other. I think that can help much more easier. In the end, I would just request once again to SDPI, Dr. Bakar and Dr. Priya, that whatever the suggestions and the recommendations come, please do share with us, do let us know. I'm so sorry I have to leave. It was not, please apologize for this. It's not that rude impression that some minister come and they deliver this speech and go. Everybody knows that when it comes to these sort of things, I try to be, I want to always to, take part from first to end, but it was on a very short notice and something, the prior commitment was being of mine previously, so I had to rush. But I would just want to request that our SDGs forum is not only for me or for some parliament, it's for all of you. You are very much openly, you can send the recommendations, you can send the ideas, you can criticize even, you can come up with the policy ideas. And we are ready to accept that, we are ready to help, and we are ready to learn. So for that, in the gender perspective as well, I think woman is something, without her, the world is not complete. If we can strengthen each other, and I think if we give a strength to a woman, either she's a daughter, either she's a mother, either she's a wife, sister, or friend. So I think we can achieve our goals very successfully. And the most important thing, I believe that when we talk about the gender, I believe that the first important law of the nature is to give respect to each other. Because when we are going to learn to give respect to each other and to listen to each other and to have the patience, I think that is the key to success. And thank you so very much. Have a nice day. I'm sorry to making you bore with my conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the passion and the commitment that you've shown to gender equality and climate. And also talking about some very critical issues like the importance of data, of course, which we all understand, but also talking about the lived experiences of people who cannot make it to our data sets sometimes. That's also a very important message that we get. We also understand that institutional memory for the work that we do is important, so that hence these forums and these partnerships that we are building through the REMIT program and SDPI are very critical to sustain the work that we are doing on gender and climate. Madam talked about gender equality as a goal, and we also talked about climate action as an SDG 13. And there is nothing more sustainable probably when you try to talk about SDGs and marrying these two probably for data work, for action work, and helping women in disaster reduction and resilience as well. Now I would like to invite our partner, Mr. Dr. Waqar Ahmed, who is the Joint Executive Director, SDPI, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Ali Khan. And I think it's a tall order to come after Melissa Sarma, especially when she has spoken from the heart. And the homework which she has given to us, the development community, is really straight from her experience as a climate change minister first, and now, of course, as Minister at SDPI for SDGs. Let me start by thanking the REMIT team for hosting us. Swansa, Radha Sarva, both of them have done tremendous work on the subject. And of course, here we are as a group to take this forward. Very grateful to FCDO for the support, the intellectual, of course, the wisdom and all the brain power that has gone behind structuring the ideas that we are presenting here today. And of course, ideas should culminate at a later stage. And also to our partners from the government who have taken time out to prioritize this agenda going forward. Amidst, of course, a lot of pessimism or cynicism, good things that happen, they often go past without being noticed. And I think one of the good things which we are discussing here is the leadership which I thought of mentioning, of course, joining us. Leadership which the Ministry of Planning has provided to this agenda, and the fact that the gender framework which they have presented, which has provided us a foundation on which we can now implement or bring about some improvements going forward. And I think that starting point, that baseline is very important. And I'd like to congratulate the government on this. Now, this is a very timely and extremely important workshop in the aftermath of course, the devastating floods, and as we stand here, the warnings for the next round of similar dangers is, of course, around the corner. Just yesterday, we had pictures from Bahrain of the lashing rains, and now, of course, the Bahrain Bazaar was closed for the past 48 hours, And the fact that these sporadic instances are now becoming much harder to capture in our day-to-day policy responses. Of course, there is a policy response, but of course, there's scale to disaster. But how does one move forward with a more agile approach towards a local area response, which is now what is required? And I would like to be educated on this in the later part of this discussion, from our experts and of course from our counterparts who are specialists in this area. Disaster lens for a gender-focused economic development, as Madam just said, is something around which our understanding has evolved only gradually. Mainstreaming hasn't been easy, It is learning by doing as we go ahead. But this approach should not just be confined to planning and development department or the select departments, of course, who are sitting here as esteemed panelists with us. There has to be an across the board, whole of the government approach, which we are here to discuss. It's not just about the federal government or a vertical positioning of this disaster lens. It has to be a federal provincial and interprovincial lens as well going forward. And I think that this is where many of the institutions around this table have done immensely important work from which we want to benefit. Now, this framework which Planning Division has, and of course would like to contribute to this, and Remit has done some background research on this. They will continue to update this research with the help of such focused discussions, And the important thing is that the framework going forward shouldn't be static. And that is where I think we require more help. Any disaster, giving disaster lens to any gender framework has to be a dynamic exercise, going forward, in which all institutions should prioritize. It shouldn't be a one-off exercise going forward. Government has a policy cycle, and annually we should understand where we need to sort of feed into that annual policy cycle, or whenever the projects are being formalized for PSTV or ATP schemes going forward. We also understand that another reason why, of course, this approach has to be dynamic in nature, and I'm very grateful for the presence of Dr. Adia as well, is the linkage of disaster, gender, and social protection. And the fact that now we are moving towards much advanced forms of poverty databases and poverty registries, and that realization is coming across provinces as well, due to which more dynamic data collection, compilation, mining systems would be required, which would also enhance our understanding of this very nexus between disaster, DRM, gender, and economic. Now, I'm happy to note that we will also hear from the University of Leeds in this discussion today. And this will be a discussion which will be shortly moderated by our colleague, Mr. Ravi Kumar. And this is an important interaction to really take a humbling standpoint and ask ourselves that there are issues in disaster gender nexus which are often not covered in our usual discussions. And one really needs to unpack them with the help of academia, which really takes a back step, goes deep into the literature, and provides us the inputs which we will be hearing in the next session. As I said, now that Planning Commission has taken the lead to formulate the National Gender Policy Framework, our hopes are that today's discussion will strengthen the framework, allow us to, of course, add on today's discussion to that framework as well. Of course, we will collectively contribute to the knowledge regarding impact and response to disasters, which needs to be part of this framework. Another opportunity, which of course we will be banking on, Madam Minister, is that some of the areas or some of your advice from today's discussion needs to be communicated to the Finance Ministry for the forthcoming budget on the 9th of June, something for which the Budget Proposals Committee is very open, and within the next 24 hours, we'll make it a point to communicate the budget-specific proposals from today's meeting to the Ministry within a very short span of time. We also are really encouraged to see the participation of other development partners who have come forward in today's discussion. And I think we need all the help. Why? Because I think these development partners are important contributors to evidence, to technical assistance, to various forms of support that go to our provinces, sub-province field formations as well. And I think this is where the overall architecture, donor coordination architecture, comes in so handy, that apart from this discussion which we are doing on the framework today, the strengthening of donor coordination architecture needs to be a central focus around this discussion. Now, I do understand that my intervention will be followed by Dr. Figa's presentation, in which one of the areas that I look forward to, I'm sure we look forward to, is the way forward for SDPI, for Remit, and how do we really put action to these words and this collective wisdom going forward. The political economy here is so whatever Matt said, one of the key challenges that we face while bridging research, dialogue, and policy, that is the implementation mechanism that one has. And whether somebody likes it or not, the only instrument of development implementation is the civil service. So my plea and my request to all the partners over here is that whatever we propose, whatever we suggest, we really have to keep in mind the capacities on ground, the challenges which our civil service faces on a day-to-day basis on ground, and really the recommendations have to be split into short, medium, and longer term. Currently, of course, the way civil service works, we don't have protected tenures for the civil service. So there is something that they can do in the short term, which is what we should help them do. And there's something which we need to part with them for the medium to longer term, for which they may require resources, they may require capacity building, which of course this community should stand ready to provide. I welcome Mr. Ali Kamal from the University of London, and it's back to you.
Thank you, Vakasha. Thank you for talking about the very important part that sometimes, especially with gender and disaster risk resilience, we are actually learning by doing. This is evolving to something that we have been facing disasters, but the fact that we now started thinking of how to introduce all these interventions at different levels, including public sector, including civil society, including development partners. When Madam Romina was talking about so much has been already done, probably as a program, Remit especially has taken a very, very practical approach to development and to economic reform and gender inclusion in it. And it has, you can excuse my saying that from really development, we are now moving to real development when it comes to gender inclusion. So thank you for saying this, and also the importance of data integration and consolidation of efforts is one area that has come out, not just at the national level or the provincial, but sub-national and local government levels as well. When we talk about data and data connection, we will have to look at all those angles. And of course, as we move forward with the day-to-day, we will see some international best practices and the work that has been done and the recommendations that they suggest for what Pakistan can do with serving gender and disaster risk resilience. Before we move to the main presentation, which is on the work that Remit and SDPI has done together on identifying the 5 pillars that can feed into the planning, ministry planning strategy as well as SDG work, I would like to have a very short introduction of everybody around the table. As we said, this is an expert group. So we're very grateful for the time that you have taken out. And if we can just, your name and the organization that you represent so that we know that we are talking to and how we would be using the expertise that we have today across the table for the work that Dr. Mukhar just talked about. So we can begin from the introduction of and your organization that you represent.
Currently, I'm part of the Living in this team, which is one of the adaptation plans developed by Mr. Banerjee.
Thank you.
This is Zulekha. I am advisor PMGCC NDMA. I'm Dr. Alia Khan. I'm a retired professor of economics, and I work in the area of labor economics and gender and social protection.
This is Usman, and I'm the investment climate lead at Remit.
Partner Pilot, Climate Change Advisor, FCDO. Flora from Adam Smith.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning. My name is Taimur Beg. I'm the Deputy Team Lead for REMI program.
Assalamualaikum everyone, this is Maheen Zara and I lead the Poverty and Social Protection Practice Area at Oxford Policy Management in Pakistan. Assalamualaikum and good morning everyone, this is Shamsa Yusuf, Assistant Manager Monitoring and Commission from NDRMM. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum ji, this is Amina Sadar, Deputy Manager Project Officers and Management at NDRMM.
Assalamualaikum, good morning. This is Dr. Pineda from National Disaster Risk Management.
My name is Gulnazam Chand from the World Bank's Social Protection and Jobs team.
Good morning. Asma Hussain from GIZ Project Strengthening Climate Adaptation and Resilience in Pakistan.
Assalamualaikum everyone, Mustafa Khan. I'm working as Technical Advisor GIZ Social Protection.
My name is Bianca and I'm also from GIZ from the Participatory Governance Program.
Assalamualaikum ji, this is Arshad from Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Department.
Assalamualaikum ji, I am Rabia Babar and I look after gender equalization and passive poverty alleviation.
So thank you for these introductions. We will be joined by more of the later stage when we have the expert group exercise. Now for the scene setting presentation, if I can invite you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Extremely grateful to the panelists and the experts in the audience for this workshop, for the presence for this workshop of critical importance. So, STPI had the opportunity to actually review the 3 prime policy documents by the Government of Pakistan with support from FCDO, RENET, and Adam Smith International, and the National Gender Policy Framework rolled out by Planning Commission of Pakistan in March 2022 happens to be one of them. And what we will be doing is that we will be giving a short review of this policy framework, as Dr. Bukar mentioned that this is actually the baseline to build upon given by Planning Commission, and then we will actually transition to the set of recommendations for integrating the disaster resilience lens. So, gender equality, it's a story of challenges and opportunities, and of course, it is at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals, the global agenda that we are pursuing. And when we talk about progress, of course, it's globally it's at a slower pace, not only in Asia. And a recent report by UNESCO highlights this progress. And globally, I believe that the stats are that it will take around 132 years to close the gender gap. So it's not a very rosy picture when we talk about gender equality. But of course, amongst developing countries, there is a recognition of these facts, and initiatives are being rolled out in this regard. So, what is the landscape of Pakistan? Again, it's a grim landscape when we talk about the nexus of women, climate change, and floods. So, there are gender disparities in Pakistan's population and workforce. There are challenges faced by the female labor, especially in the agriculture sector, and the impacts of floods on female labor actually a disproportionate impact, and they are much more vulnerable as compared to men. They are at the front line or the forefront of facing the climate stress. And if I give some stats in this regard, there are 60 million women of working age. However, in Pakistan, only 22%
our participation in paid labor. And there is a wage gap, an immense wage gap, where the income of women is much less than the average income of men, and this wage gap stands at 50%. And further, this gender wage gap costs Pakistan around 500 billion annually, we estimate it. And when we talk about the challenges and also the inequality faced by women, the estimates are around 2.6% of GDP. So the state of gender, if we talk about the indexes and other indicators, so again, it's a great landscape, and there are 6 core indices, but we're not performing fairly on them. Just that only 5% of leadership roles with women, and we need to actually accelerate this drive towards gender empowerment, gender inclusion, and then integrating it with this impact taken by climate and disasters. So in terms of climate vulnerability, we are ranked 8th on the Global Climate Risk Index, and there's hard evidence from the recent floods that disproportionate impacts, they actually caused women in Pakistan, especially from the poor strata and the vulnerable and ultra-poor, to revert to damaging coping strategies. So this evidence suggests that there is amplification of gender gaps during the pandemic, and in the next round of findings from one of the studies from Pakistan that will be presented by Professor Gary Dubinsky from Leeds University, that will reinforce these findings and will actually highlight more of these aspects. And then there is projection of job losses and effects on women leadership, wage inequalities, and economic opportunities. So there's a need to address gender impact of shocks, inclusion of women in relief and development programs, and also for the integrating of remedial measures in social protection and safety net programs. So the National Gender Policy Framework, it actually comes with the 6 set of objectives or pillars, and it encompass governance, education, employment, health and well-being, safety and security, and agency critical participation. And they're quite holistic in nature. There's a strong emphasis on gender. There's an overwhelming emphasis on COVID because when it was rolled out, COVID had this huge impact. However, the disaster risk management and disaster risk resilience lens is to be integrated. It needs to be more highlighted, and the mechanism must be suggested in this regard. So just in the interest of time, I will skip the details of these pillars, and I will come to the set of recommendations as the DRR and DRR lens need to be added thoroughly in this framework. So our set of recommendations after the review, they come across these 5 pillars, where the essential ones are developing gender data repository. Then again, there's a focus on governance. There's a pillar of gender responsive infrastructure that needs to be developed. And then digitalization is one of the entry points for disaster risk resilience. And the last is to actually leverage interventions for DRR. And again, since this framework predates the flood disasters, these are additions, these are suggestions to for more holistic policy framework to come across. So the first set of recommendation is about developing gender data repository. We need gender-specific, short-responsive data and hotspot mapping. And what hotspot mapping does is that it provides robust basis for targeting investments in areas where women are most at risk due to climate change, while preventing the acceleration of inequalities. So it's essentially a strategic alignment framework, and as you can see, in this framework there are 3 components: climate hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, how women are exposed And all these three pillars come across and they comprise the hotspot mapping. So again, for a very deliverable hotspot mapping, these three pillars need to be aligned. If alignment is missing, then the productive outcomes will not be there. Then there's a suggestion for Gender Action Lab. So this National Gender Policy Framework mentions the Gender Action Lab. However, the dynamics of how it will be devised or what will be its core objectives, they are actually they need to be deliberated on. So we have suggested a roadmap for Gender Action Lab, how it can address systematic inequities, how redesigning can be done under the umbrella of Gender Action Lab, and we can assess the impact of new policy practices and processes. And then this lab can actually publish an annual State of Gender report for Pakistan, and the government organizations, apart from Planning Commission, can also participate into the outputs of this initiative. And again, there's a mention of Gender Equality Monitor, and there's a suggestion that it can bring together a collection of metrics in one location to track gender equality in 5 major areas, which are economic participation and progression, attitudes and leadership, education and skills, and then of course DRR and well-being and health. And this monitor should be embedded with the central databases of private and public institutions to capture the real picture of ground realities related to gender inequality. Then there's a suggestion of developing gender data repository. Of course, we know that there's a initiative by National Commission on the Status of Women or data portal, but this is suggestion for more evidence-guided gender mainstreaming, and where a gender disaggregated data collection can be done and working tools can be created to allow informed policy analysis, and strong governance structure based on macro criticality of gender that can also be leveraged, and increasing engagement with external partners and making the most use of gender resources by this centralized unit can also pave way for actually integrating this disaster lens into gender policies. And then from the angle of governance, actually it's high time that our structures and institutional mechanisms must move from traditional gender approaches. So it's a move from gender exploitative to gender inclusion and then eventually gender transformation. And the warning systems, early warning systems are of critical importance. So gender sensitive early warning system for disasters or the outreach in terms of early warnings is very important. So how this dissemination can be done, how this warning can be conveyed. So tailored message, friendly interface for the audience, use of community influencers in the shape of influential women's, and then aligning it with the cultural norms. So all these are tools and mechanisms for conveying this early warning systems that is actually present missing from the governance structure. Then this is evidence from developing countries that this intervention works, which is women participation in governance and management of relief camps. There's evidence from Latin America, there's evidence from Africa. That's a workable phenomena, and in this engaging local women in supervising relief camps, cash for work activities, mentoring, and active management of operations with government collaboration. So it empowers women economically, it protects them from violence in disaster-struck areas and foster community resilience. It also provide perspectives for shaping post-disaster interventions. Then again, there's a global drive for ecofeminism and food defense, and again, there must be community mentors for disaster risk management, and there should be specially designed programs for women to be more protected from disasters, including shock, and especially for older women. And then again, a very important pillar is care economy. So again, the stat for Pakistan shows that 32% of women in paid work, while 52% unpaid work, and it costs around 2.6% of GDP. So just like the 3 R's to save the planet, reuse, reduce, and recycle, we need 3 R's in terms of care economy to recognize the unpaid work, to reduce it, and redistribute and reallocate the gender roles. And it must be coupled with decent work, a threshold income, which is provided with security, and taking women out of time poverty. So this can empower women to actually embrace the impact of catastrophes which comes their way. So care economy needs to be remodeled, or this rethinking of care economy that is needed for women empowerment, face further integration of disaster risk management and resilience. Again, mobility is a prime area, and the National Gender Policy Framework touches upon the transportation planning and transportation mechanism. Social mobility is very much dependent upon the transportation mechanisms, and there are multiple suggestions to how this transportation planning or transportation decision-making process can actually involve women, and this is more conducive for women. And again, since a majority of the women who are working in Pakistan, they belong to agriculture and labor class. So again, this labor saving infrastructure needs to be introduced, and there must be provisions regarding that for outcomes that can actually tackle the risk. Gender sensitivity trainings, breaking the norms. Again, this global evidence that discriminatory legislation and social practices, it actually deprive women from multiple rights and actually slow down the progress, especially in terms of being more resilient. So this gender justice and actually educating the youth and the men about it. So that is also more of an area of capacity building that can be leveraged upon. And again, a very essential, this is the last slide, I believe, it is interventions for DRR and DRM. So there's a need for actually conducting impact evaluation and pilots. There's a dire need to devise and launch holistic interventions for DRR and DRM, more on the construct of treatment groups and impact evaluations. So we have been, over time, we have been experimenting with mitigation, whereas adaptation is much cheaper, and it's primarily an answer for disaster resilience. So in this regard, if only one community can be monitored, a pilot project with all the rigors of climate change challenge, equipped with gender lens that can be showcased globally, such as at COP, a case scenario that what kinds of intervention works and facilitate resilience in the face of catastrophe. And these interventions must be based on the indigenous knowledge, where we are lagging considerably, where we actually raise the moot questions. And then the last is recasting the policy. So another starting point would be recasting of the national climate change policy with the integration of disaster risk angle and making it a guiding document in this sense. A second step would be a process of PSTP allocations for developing provincial early warning systems, which comprise of the components of actually devising policies, then training of the relevant ministries and officials, and development of community coordination mechanism at ground level that remain in action all year round with a very strong and effective mechanism. And these interventions are contrary to the short-term fixes that fail to create the impact over time. And the last is digitalization, that is the entry point. So when we talk about the resilience of the poorest 40% of Pakistani population, especially the women who are belonging to ultra poor or vulnerable groups, so we need to rethink business as usual social protection. So expecting anything ambitious out of social protection, that it will lead to poverty alleviation, of course, that is not the prime objective. Social protection is meant for consumption smoothing. But COVID and the floods, they have taught us a lesson that we need to rethink social protection, where we have to take this social protection on the safety net beneficiaries through a full circle of financial inclusion, where they transition from savings to borrowing and then to insurance and then digital transactions. And it's very important. These are not meaningless digital transactions. These are actually digital data points that are very much needed in the system. And it's primarily these saving models, whether they are voluntary or involuntary in nature, and then the asset transfer model, livelihood generation models, labor market readiness model that needs to be incorporated into the social protection regime for sustainability, because disaster risk resilience and disaster risk management requires sustainability. So there's a dire need to leverage digital inclusion and digital literacy and put these vulnerable and ultra poor through full circle of financial inclusion, and not just getting satisfied on the simple definition of financial inclusion that is enough. So I would like to stop here because these are lineup of 20 panelists.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shweta. This was the work, the policy review work that we were doing for the past 2 months with SBTi. And the pillars that we saw, they will be basically integrated into the pillars of the national gender framework of the planning system, the list of planning, how they need to integrate the governance part of the economic empowerment part, or even the social protection and other opportunities and the participation part as well. So now we'll be glad to have a very esteemed panel with us. She's talked about the fact that she's happy to see the public sector, the development sector, and everybody is represented so well, including research and policy tools. Reason is that we have been talking about consolidation of not just data, but also consolidation of effort, able to make any sort of impact. I would like to ask, I reintroduce the panel because I did it in the morning, so that those who come here can know who is also on our sitting. We have this panel here from FCDO, who is the SRO for the REMIT program. We have Mr. Salim Ransa from the National Commission for the Status of Women, who is the Secretary of the Status of Women. Very important representation from our point of view, because we talked about how civil service needs to be a very critical part of the work that we do. They are the ones who can sustain it for us. We have Mr. Bilal Al-Warsab, who is from the National Council Risk Management Fund. Thank you for joining us. Their work is also very important, especially, and come to you for the question on the disaster risk financing work that we plan to do. And of course, Mr. Ali Kamal, who has been a good support for us during this review process, as well as the commitment that he has shown as the chief SDGs for at the Ministry of Planning. We have been in the morning session talking about how SDGs is the way forward, how integrating our work with the SDGs agenda of the country and also into the consortium, the parliamentary consortium that is now being made on climate and gender, is something that we are looking forward to working more with, not just the Ministry of Planning, but also across the parts of the government and development sector. And last but not the least, thank you, Dr. Wakar, for your leadership. Sometimes humble leadership is an equally important part in making people, all of us, move towards the work that we want to do and actually achieve that. And of course, Dr. Fariha has presented this now for all the hard work, all the commitment, and all the innovation with idea generation as well as intervention and action plans. Thank you. Before we move to online, we have Mr. Gary Javinsky with us, who is a professor at the Leeds University. And we would be hearing from him because this is a very important part of our work of international best practices and international academia working on projects which are very relevant to Pakistan. So his research with Minal Usman, who is Pakistani researcher on the amplification of gender-based economic disparities during Pakistan's 2022 plans, is a very important research element for us, and we will be hearing from him. But we will be moving to Mr. Bilal. Bilal sir, as the CEO of NDIRMF, you have been working on this area for quite long. And we understand that the 2022 floods, even though they did not come as a surprise, but the systems were not prepared, neither the institutional systems, nor civil society systems, not even community. So how do you look at that, and how do you plan as the fund to work towards interventions specifically on gender and again on the disaster risk financing that we talk about, to prepare not just systems before disaster strike, but also make them resilient enough to disaster?
Thank you very much. I think yeah. So I think Madam Rovina this morning actually sort of the remarks raised a couple of very interesting insights. And one expectation I had was why what is the gender division mainstreaming of gender? I think there's another perspective because broader perspective on this particular problem. This whole perspective revenue mobilization, income tax, and we are sitting there today looking at and how to integrate, how to tightly into the gender perspective, broad macroeconomic concerns. I think already started quite now, how are we going to be successful at the right this conclusion of this particular project? I think this will be to be seen. I think this is a good start. So in that particular respect, I think it's a very good initiative. And while I was do this particular project, actually, I think you have made something very interesting as a exciting initiative. For example, speaking this morning that there is a very close gender focus audit of a single window, which is extremely interesting. Actually, this you up and the LMF, actually, I might in that as well, and so that highlight giving us some extremely valuable information and insight into the work we have been doing and how sensitive we have been in terms of now, I think this is good work, and I see this direction is good. A couple of other things, I think, before I come to your question. I think the recommendations are pretty comprehensive. You have some graphs. A couple of areas which you might want to consider, you might want to kind of strengthen or tighten up is, I think, like Priya mentioned, is 22% of the, we are only, Pakistan only represent 22% of the paid labor in the overall labor statistics of Pakistan. I think I was a little bit surprised. I mean, personally, I thought that might have been even lower. Is on the lower end of the equation. I think in economics, again, very, very important area. I think what is is informal economics. So you might have considered, might have a presentation. So we know this very famous and another very interesting statistic is that depending on how you 9% of our GDP can be enhanced with the informal sector participation of accounting of the informal sector in the economy, and then that automatically actually increases and enhances the staff and in the GDP. So if you're from a purely project management point of view, on a lighter note, I know Sumanta is thinking on this work, you might want to make a very good note of it. I think if we are talking about 10, potential for 10 to 9%, just including the accounting of the informal sector, then I think your overall goal for increasing tax GDP ratio from 30 to 18%, I think that will be a very comfortable contribution, and your reserve framework of course will be going up. So I think that is a few areas which of course can be right, and I can snack. Now coming to your sorry for this long moral and intellectual obligation that I do bring out with these important points. I think as we learned from this morning, that Priya gender inclusion, gender mainstreaming, performative approaches, I think it's a journey, and it becomes even more complex, it becomes even more difficult in some cultural aspirations as well within Pakistan. Sometimes actually we something to the culture that we actually hide behind the culture that anything which is culturally justifiable, try to kind of build from the policy intervention, some framework as well as the projects, those areas. Now, when I look into the ERMF work, I think we might have suffered a little bit in that area, in that context as well. Particularly, we work our project interventions of projects have been in very remote areas, vulnerable areas, where in itself design and implement a project is difficult. Now, in the gender, especially in a very standardized fashion, it becomes even more complex. So this is not a justification. We are not been extremely successful in that respect. But this is just to highlight the activities and the challenges when it comes to project design and implementation, and then of course trying to conclude the results to make it forward. So I think if we look at, we have a sizable fund. We have funded projects, we have implemented projects across Pakistan, and the gender consideration, gender inclusion have always been a very essential and core element of our own project intervention. We made sure that there is we applied quite successfully. Actually, we applied thanks to our fund implementation partners. We applied the 20-based approaches, and we thought that this might be the most simple and appropriate way of doing that. This, of course, bring a very good result, and it poses some limitations as well, because we have kind of around the part of the reality. I think the flood 22, of course, it kind of showcased, it realized number of limitations, number of challenges. There was an early phase, because before beach of flood, we realized that this is a kind of a fundamental statement that any disaster hit woman in a scheme disproportionate manner. But I think, and then budget some numbers, and similarly in the flood situation, we have seen the number of women, pregnant women and lactating women, how they suffer. No one of course wants to deny about the suffering. But I think it's very difficult to encompass that we can do it just. Some of us, some of the colleagues who were working on the ground, actually they gave us some very insightful stories. You mentioned about the experiences. I think there's another kind of area, there's a kind of observing experience. Observing experience of those who are living through that. I think this is what we try to kind of capture and try to integrate in terms of how we can move forward, how we can integrate into our future intervention. This, of course, demanded, and we did that to go back to drawing board and have a very fresh, realistic look at the design of our projects, how we design it, how we interact with our partners who are actually coming up with the project proposals and the idea, how we undertake the appraisal and evaluation of our project, whether gender perspective have been fully integrated or not, and then have a realistic evaluation of it, how far we can make progress in this particular area. Very recently, I was meeting with somebody came and we had an organization called German organization CPM, who actually look into their focus on the work of disabled. Now, having a discussion with them, and actually, this was quite eye-opening that when we the fund were designing the projects, and we have very largely overlooked in our social and social safeguard. Now, within the disabled people, there is a gender perspective and a gender aspiration as well, which of course have been largely ignored. So I think we see that the considerable work has been done, a lot has to be done. I think gender plans and policy frameworks, and I think it is based on a kind of a rights-based approach. I think this is what is, and we know the global principle, we know the human characters, which actually give us some very practical guidelines and practical frameworks, which of course we can engage and we can apply in our tools and in our implementation. I think more than that, there's a need for training, there's a need for capacity building, not only on our side, but on our partner side as well. And of course, with the government institutions, actually have the front runners come up with. So congratulations once again, and I think there is some kind of a low-hanging fruits which you might want to kind of integrate to improve your design framework. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Mr. Vidal, especially for being very honest about the limitations with the work that we have, because we see very honest publicly about what they can do and what they. Also, I think the point on the gender audits is well noted, and if we get support that we will be authority right on stage, so we can obviously be looking at that. Also, thank you for talking about the fact that it's not just people who are in the data sets, but also people who make it into data sets. There's equally important, especially with women, that is a problem. It can be a communication problem, it can be an access problem, and that is what we're trying to look into the work that we are doing. And also the climate justice, Minister Saib also talked about rights based on social climate. It is now a human rights issue more than anything else. So yes, we will be taking whatever recommendations you have given us, and we will be taking it forward. I will definitely be sharing some of the action plans with you as well. Now I would like to invite Professor Gary Dybinski and Ms. Danahil Usman from the University of Leeds, UK, to present the work that they have done, the research on the amplification of gender-based economic disparities during Pakistan's 2022 plan. So we're looking at some policy insights and recommendations from you. Gary, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. Let me just quickly share my slides before I move forward. Please do let me know when these are visible.
We can see it, Manahil, so you can.
Okay. So hello everyone, I'm Manahil Usman, and today I will be presenting to you my research on the amplification of gender-based economic disparities during crisis in developing countries, within which I have taken the Pakistan 2022 floods as a case study. And after this presentation, I'll pass it on to my research supervisor, Professor Gary Dybinski, who will then be going through the policy implications and universal best practices regarding gender. So as a brief content overview, I'll be going through my research outline, where I'll describe the research background a bit and go through the hypothesis before diving further into the research findings, which can be split into short-term and long-term or medium to long-term findings themselves. Now, in August 2022, Pakistan experienced its wettest summer since 1961. And at the climax of the floods, a third of the country was submerged underwater, and 33 million people were reportedly affected. Many news articles, such as these, highlighted the disproportionate impact of flooding on women in particular, who were far more vulnerable than men to disaster impacts and struggled more to access relief. This comes in hand with extensive literature which suggests crises such as natural disasters are likely to amplify existing socioeconomic inequalities within developing nations. And gender-based inequalities are amplified largely due to women's limited socioeconomic mobility and access to social protection. This study is centered then around gauging an in-depth overview of the disproportionate impacts of Pakistan's 2022 floods on women, and is an attempt to understand the extent of inequality amplification from disasters in developing nations. Now, past research and economic literature suggests that crisis has a twofold effect on vulnerable groups of the population. In the immediate aftermath of disaster, any inequality gaps are widened. However, there are also studies conducted in developing countries across the globe which suggest some economic opportunities stemming from crisis in the long run, where any inequalities are found to contract post-crisis due to relief and rehabilitation policies or programs. Such research then leads to the following two hypotheses. Firstly, testing whether crisis amplifies gender-based economic disparities, and secondly, whether these disparities could contract beyond pre-crisis levels given any economic opportunity which is exploited during recovery. Now, as a brief outline of this study's methodology, it takes a qualitative analysis approach where primary data was collected through semi-structured interviews. The data was collected in March 2023, and a purposive sample of 24 experts from 3 main sectors were interviewed. These sectors include economists, specializing in either gender, climate change, or crisis resilience, to gain a perspective on the economic impacts of 2022 floods on women. Secondly, they include relief workers in NGOs and INGOs based in Pakistan, ranging from directors and CEOs to field workers directly engaged with flood victims. And this was done to gain anecdotal evidence from flood victim perspectives through stakeholders, alongside gauging whether disaster and relief schemes can acknowledge a gender lens within their policies. And then thirdly, some government organization employees were also interviewed who had specialties in disaster risk management to kind of gauge the responsiveness, preparedness, and resilience to natural disaster in Pakistan. In terms of the gender-based disparity amplification, 5 main factors were voiced by experts. Firstly is the socio-economic mobility barriers that currently exist in Pakistan, particularly for women. Existing mobility barriers amongst women amplify their economic vulnerability during the floods as compared to men, and they struggled in accessing relief sources, humanitarian aid services, income-generating opportunities, and flood distribution sites. One such example is given from an expert field worker who mentioned how this mobility barrier could also impact women's mortality rates, where if a woman is unwell, she would require a chaperone to visit medical sites compared to men who were free to move about. Then secondly, limitations to decision-making power were also highlighted, and women in flood-affected areas were largely dependent economically on male members of the household who were in charge of decision-making and providing the household with basic commodities and resources. To quote another expert, they mentioned how these women don't even have the power to decide if they can displace from these flood-affected areas or if they have to stay there because they are so dependent on the male decision, which again impacts their mortality rates. And then thirdly, food security was greatly impacted. Now, anecdotal evidence suggested that if a household had limited food commodities, preference was given to the male members of the household, with female members often having to skip meals. This was justified by these victims claiming the male members as having greater nutritional needs as they had to engage in labor to earn income for the household. Which brings me to the second point about food security. Women faced economic mobility barriers, as mentioned, and so were mostly unemployed and had high dependency on male members of the household who were responsible for providing them with food and other resources. When these male members struggled to fulfill this responsibility, women's food security insecurity was greatly increased as they were left helpless and had no other resources to turn to. And then as a fourth aspect, loss of livelihood was also highlighted by most of the experts that I interviewed. And they mentioned how 40% of the women in Pakistan were employed in the agricultural sector within crop work or working with livestock. And due to the mass devastation in agricultural land caused by these floods, primary sources of income for women were immediately impacted. Access to alternative livelihood opportunities, especially for rural women, was also limited because of their limited mobility, lack of skill, literacy, and therefore amplified women's economic vulnerability during these floods and their economic status and any opportunity. And this was also supported by another interview statement who said that prior to the 2022 floods and after a decade of struggle, we had moved towards 28% female labor force participation, and that figure post-floods fell down to 20% in the immediate aftermath. Lastly, enrollment in education and female literacy rates were also discussed, and how floods and any disasters can impact women's prolonged education through destruction, fueling learning disparities, and amplifying gender gaps within education. So another interview can be quoted here, who said that a lot of girls in the Dadu district, even before floods, were not enrolled in schools due to distance between homes and schools and women's limited mobility. But after the floods, none of the girls were enrolled in schools. Now, on a positive note, some NGO employees in particular highlighted some economic opportunity that could stem from crisis itself. To, again, quote another expert, "No doubt this is the crisis, but at the same time, this is the big opportunity as well, particularly to empower women economically through intentional intervention." And three main factors were highlighted in contributing to this economic opportunity, which is relief intervention from NGOs and INGOs, gender budgeting, and participatory development practices. Within relief and rehabilitation, I would like to mention one particular example. So an organization in Sindh has been employing the gender lens on both the supply and demand side of relief, which was quite unique compared to any other organizations that I interviewed. That is that they had a project where they were distributing sanitary products and hygiene kits to flood-affected women, but instead of purely making distributions on this demand side of relief, they were also engaging 400 flood-affected women in producing these projects by providing them with machinery, with skill, and raw materials, therefore generating livelihoods and addressing any needs of flood victims themselves. Moving on to gender budgeting, a lot of victims also highlighted the progress and the success of the Benazir Income Support Program and how gender budgeting improves women's decision-making power and increased freedom within their consumption choices. Although some experts also suggested that gender budgeting helps improve women's decision-making power where this is limited. However, in areas where women have absolutely no decision-making power, gender budgeting alone did not show significant improvement. So this is something that must be kept in mind. And then lastly, participatory development practices were also deemed to be a great mechanism for improving women's economic participation in the active labor force. And one interviewee mentioned how unless the beneficiary leads their own development, that development ends up being completely useless. Participatory development practices were also seen to increase male receptiveness regarding women's economic progress, as they were in a state of shock and were open to receiving any support and were in a hurry to rebuild their community. So we're willing to engage all members of the community to rebuild and rehabilitate. Now, in the long-term impacts of the crisis and to gauge long-term economic opportunity, given the recency of 2022 floods, participants were asked about 2010 floods and its aftermath. And given that most of them had expertise in this, we were able to understand better how, in the long run, crises can be a lasting opportunity. And they mentioned how women's income generating opportunities increased and how their mobility increased and how relief schemes and relief intervention policies improved women's mobility in going about in the markets and selling or creating products and building networks for themselves for better income generation. And this income generation amongst women also impacted future generations of women because women were seen to be better in terms of saving and were more forward-looking in terms of their investment and ended up investing in their children's education regardless of their gender. So women's income generation and mobility not only influenced their own economic opportunity and status, they also improved future generations' opportunities as well. Although, despite this long-term opportunity from the 2010 floods, one thing that was highlighted greatly amongst all participants was how external factors have been hindering progress in 2022, given contextual differences. These external factors include accelerating impacts of climate change and the increased magnitude of the 2022 floods versus those of 2010. And then secondly, the situation regarding layered crises and how added pressures of multiple simultaneous crises in Pakistan, such as COVID-19, hyperinflation, and extreme poverty, have been further exacerbating any disparities within the country far beyond the flooding impacts themselves. And then lastly, the reduced resource funding and capacity of the nation to withstand natural disasters in 2022 versus 2010. So one of the experts in disaster management mentioned how for the 2010 floods, communities were more resilient as they had just survived the 2005 earthquake. And Pakistanis were trained post-2005 crisis on how to deal better with future emergencies. So their capacity to face disaster was far greater than 2022. However, for the 2022 floods, there was a 12-year gap, and mass devastation coupled with limited training to deal with emergencies caused greater amplification and is hindering currently any rehabilitation or progress beyond recovery. One last theme that was discussed by experts was policy gaps and scope for policy intervention, one of which was the lack of evidence-based policy and how there were gaps within flood victims and policymakers in terms of communication on what the needs and requirements of flood victims are and how effective a policy could be in meeting those needs and requirements. And then secondly, some experts also mentioned how the 2010 learnings were not implemented to a great extent, and there exists a gap in using past evidence to build better policy. And then overall, a lack of a multi-crisis framework was also voiced, and how there is a need to build policies that can address layered crises in one time period, and how our policy design is currently to tackle one crisis at a time only.
Can we now move to recommendations or the insights part?
Yes, I'm just moving on to that. I was just covering the summary on that. So in terms of summarizing the research itself, as for hypothesis 1, it stands true that in the aftermath of Pakistan's floods, existing gender-based disparities were greatly amplified. And in terms of the medium term, hypothesis 2 found a lot of evidence to support post-crisis opportunity. I will then end there and pass it on to Professor Gary Dymski for his work on policy.
Thank you, Minahil. Can you hear me? It's okay? Okay, so I'm going to speak my remarks. I do have some prepared remarks that I'll pass along. I'm going to start by appreciating Dr. Fariha's emphasis on identifying global best practices. But I have to say, having worked at this for some years, that the best practices we can find are at a small scale, and they do show that the importance of building gender-aware policies really at all levels, both economic and social, at the meso level, in the city level, but also we have to pay attention to the global levels as well, because in some sense the disasters we see locally are clearly rooted in the global problem of climate change. So what we have here is the inequality of women is a multi-scalar problem, such as will only worsen. As my brilliant supervisee Minahil has said, we have layered crises, and these result from the different scales that contribute to this situation. So let's start at the lowest level and kind of work our way up. So start with the household level. There we can sort of pay attention to making progress on inequality of women. If we can move toward a holistic appreciation of women's role in household reproductive labor, as well as in income earning activity. With this mutual appreciation and what Dr. Faria called respect, with this comes co-participation in decision-making with inside the household as well as in the broader economy and society. This raises the question, I should say there's an opportunity here as we see a shift toward circular economies, toward rethinking value and moving beyond standard interpretations of what value is. This is going to be increasingly important as we move ahead in the era of climate change. Now, surrounding the households are what some have called the care economy. In a project in which I participated, sponsored by the UK Women's Budget Group, it was called the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy. This was 2017 to 2020. We focused on the need for a system of support for the needs of children, of dependent family members, and of the aged. We call it the so-called purple economy. And this is basically to note that the medical and educational and other institutions that enable people and take care of them are a critical foundation to the economy as a whole. So we have to take a whole systems approach. And so many of the suggestions that are summarized by Minihil, gender budgeting, participatory development, as she notes, individually they're not sufficient. But these are all components that, as we found in our work in the UK Commission, have to be woven together into one series of whole system changes to move women forward. Okay, secondly, let's move to women's potential to participate more fully in the economy. Now, this has to be done flexibly, depending on local circumstance. And the sort of one of the foundational shifts in this direction was the creation of the Grameen Bank, microfinance. And actually, microfinance is very effective when we have shortages of capital and the resilient local structures of friends and neighbors that can be built upon to use trust and reputation as an alternative to market-based collateral. This does have its limits, and it's important to know that such initiatives, microenterprise, for example, can be, when they're taken over by purely market-oriented operators, can actually move in the direction of increasing debt burdens rather than opening more opportunities. That said, a full-scale support for women-owned businesses is a path which could be microfinance or could be SMEs at a broader scale. That is a path toward addressing inequality for sure. The problems here are often access to markets and access to finance. We can think of the government policies that can help with both of these. One is government procurement incentives for women-owned businesses can level the playing field. And then there can be targeted financing to support women-owned businesses, co-ops, alternative organizations from the bottom up. We could imagine support using a development banking approach and with some knowledge exchange involved. The central bank could be involved in that, or a development bank. We can think of a public requirement that asks financial institutions to reinvest in such efforts, not just to worry about the bottom line. Leaving that aside, now let's move to the regional and urban scale. In the wake of flooding especially, it's important to look at the ecological resilience of urban and rural settlements, given the increased occurrence and severity of flooding. Now, strides have been made here. Bangladesh and India are worth looking at. Dr. Nilofer Bakhtiar has highlighted this morning that what we need are some experiments, some case studies in adaptation. That's an important step that must be taken. This brings us then to the the Sustainable Development Goals and the needs of developing sources of financing for these initiatives. The deforestation and transformation of the landscape of South Asia is rooted in, of course, in this imperial past of this area. And we have a need really to have global funding of SDGs far in excess of what's available now, which means that we have to come to, we have a Pakistan with the 5th highest population on earth, but the 22nd rank in GDP. There has to be some rebalancing. And this brings us then to the macro and international cross-border scale. 3 movements across borders that we have to identify. The first movement is kind of strange to think this way. Global warming is a cross-border movement. To create havoc, of course. It accelerates the shift of people, people and capital across borders. These are the causes of the 2022 floods, right? The impact of climate change, melting glaciers, warming seas and oceans, deforestation. Pakistan contributes 1% toward climate change, but faces some of the most devastating consequences. The second cross-border movement is the movement of people, often to remit are paramount. Pakistan ranks 4th globally behind only India, Mexico, and Egypt, ahead even of the Philippines. This results in a brain drain in part. We have to think about how can we create the conditions for generating innovation and new industries and that are socioeconomically and ecologically responsive to the challenges of our time within the Pakistani economy. The third movement across borders, of course, is the movement of capital. Capital flight's been a huge problem. I'll leave that there. The step to impose capital controls is much needed and overdue, so that's a good step forward. Now, the loss of people and capital puts increasing weight on those who are left in the country and creates even more need for a more level plan.
Professor Derek, we are like, if we get invited in the next 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Fair enough. Let me make a couple of comments and then I'll wrap it up. One is that, I'm sorry?
No, I think this is fine, 2 minutes.
Okay, having trouble hearing you. Should I say a couple more words or stop here?
No, you can wind up in the next 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll just take a couple of minutes to do that. Basically, what we have is a need for action at the global level. And here, it would be very important for Pakistan to make contact, more contact with the UNDP and the Commission on the Status of Women, more contact with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which represents the interest of emerging market economies in the global system. We've been calling for debt renegotiation, for expanding the means of financing the SDGs, and basically moving toward a more equitable world. I've put my remarks written so that I'll pass those along so that the final points of policy can be studied a little bit. But basically, there's movement in the right direction. But my key points are the following, that basically 3 things here, 4. First, we have to pay attention to all levels of social and economic interaction, household, micro, meso, macro, and global, in order to move women forward. Secondly, there is a need for case studies to explore how to transform the socioeconomic role of women and to make the communities in which they live more resilient. Thirdly, there's a need to provide finance both for not just for recovery from disasters, but for the provision of everyday economic opportunity for those especially who've been excluded from equal participation. Finally, there's a need to engage with multilateral organizations such as the UNDP, UNCTAD, AIIB, and the ADB to ensure that Pakistan women's voices are heard and their interests are at the table. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Gary. And such has been the interest in the work that you've done that we already have a question for you from one of the panelists. So can you take a question?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Devi. I'm Ajay Imran Raza, I'm Secretary, National Commission on Status of Women. I'm a senior bureaucrat in Pakistan. I have let's say an observation and also a question because we have done a good work and your earlier presenter has also made a good presentation. As far as the policy scope is concerned, you spoke about 2-3 important things, but I would like to mention two ground realities first and then ask you a question. The first thing is that already we have discussed that we need to collect important data, and that data should be in disaggregated form. As in the opening remarks, Ms. Kull mentioned about women who are not even included in the data sets. So first of all, collection of data for any finalization of policy scope is very vital. One. Number two is that we need to understand the word climate equity. Climate equity is most important principle which must observe before finalizing any policy scope. And that includes already their vulnerable sections like what you call women, children, especially women with disabilities. And disabilities are of different natures. Some are blind, some are impaired hearing, some are physically disabled. So you need to have a nuanced policy framework at this point. And the burdens are also unequal. So what we need to ensure is that we need to share the resources in proportion to the burden or the inequality of already existing. This is what policy equity, climate equity, I mean. Now how to do it, the how part is the most important aspect. For me, there are 3 important aspects which your policy scope must include. Number one, keeping in the 2 factors I've just mentioned. Number one is the distributive justice. Whether we are fair in allocating resources while after the calamity has occurred. And number 2, procedural justice, which is fairness in distribution. Because these 2 things I've seen as a senior bureaucrat are the Achilles heel of our policy implementation. And last but not least is the intergenerational equity. This actually relates to the short term, as Dr. Makkar said, short term and long term policies. Short term policies for today's generation and long term policies for tomorrow's future generation. So these were the 3 things which I feel that every policy scope must include, and in understanding the 2 contexts. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Let me maybe respond to this. That's a very elegant statement. Let me just respond by highlighting 3 points that you've made that are crucial. Because I'm engaged here in the UK with a large-scale regional resilience and inclusive growth project at the present moment. And first, the need for evidence-based policy is crucial, and we don't have enough information. So the kind of studies that, say, Minihil has put together, this can be, both a narrative information and also statistical, is completely crucial to basically transforming the policy discourse and opening up the eyes of people for whom they wake up tomorrow and they can't imagine that there could be a different tomorrow. So first thing is evidence. The second thing, I like the idea of climate equity as a principle. We need something like this. You know, famously, the Prime Minister of Barbados, whose country is threatened with immersion in the ocean, has led the way in pointing out to the problem of cost and loss. And this is fundamental. And actually, as I would emphasize in my remarks, we don't just need more loans in a debt-led global economy. We need transfers of purchasing power and of resource to make things happen, to make change in the way we live, the way we work with our climate, and the way that we value and relate to one another in our economies and everyday life. This, however, means, as you say, short-term and long-term. We have opportunities to make change as we can. And frankly, although, for example, UNCTAD, we've identified that there's a need for about $3 trillion per year that will be required to finance the SDGs. We are so far short of that it's not even serious. So we need a big push. I have to say, the progress I was mentioning at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, this was all progress that we made prior to the pandemic. Once the pandemic hit, then it was all the conversation's been about the pandemic. Now the conversation is about the Ukraine war. We've pushed climate change and we've pushed the SDGs off the global agenda. They have to be moved back on. And so I like the idea that we have to work short-term and long-term. And really, we need a world that's at peace and in which China and the US figure out how to work together and to avoid decoupling. And because we need one another across the globe.
Thank you, Professor Kelly. Thank you for the importance of evidence-based policy. And this leaves the question that I want to ask Franza, the Secretary of the National Status of Women. It is a body which has the primary strategic responsibility of reviewing everything, all laws and also implementation and suggesting, and also probably adding to and working towards the numbers that we have on, what number is Pakistan on gender equality index. I think the National Commission does feed into that data as well. And now that you have a national data portal for gender coming up, or is it already there, we would like to know how you think we should be moving forward with this idea of gender and climate data, and then working towards different action items on that. And how can the National Commission support, and how can it be supported, and how can it support other organizations?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very important question, but I don't think so. I have much time as a panelist to speak on that. But that's a very, very pertinent question to ask. I tell you a few things about NCSW, because I think as secretary, I'm a new secretary of the commission, but I'm very, SSR as well, I'm very committed to this cause, because without commitment, focus, and clarity, cannot achieve anything. Because to the whole audience, I must tell you one thing: whatever policies you carve out, whatever programs, whatever mechanisms you adopt, whatever SOPs you bring, by the end of the day, what it matters is the attitude. If the attitude towards gender sensitivity is not there, then all these policies will not be getting the same success which we envision. And this is the focus. That's why our monitoring and evaluation criteria is so poor. So this is the opening remark I want. Secondly, I want to tell you that as far as the climate is concerned, we are the 10th most climate country in the world. And as far as the rural women is concerned, like 9.5 million women work in rural areas. And in the ranking of vulnerable countries, we are 139th 153 and 182 parameters. We have readiness to how to solve this resilience. Readiness to be resilient. My point here is that NCSW can play a very pivotal keeping in view the 18th Amendment. We have devolved the subject of gender issues, women issues to the respective provincial headquarters. But one of the major, what you call the challenge for NCSW is, and we have already started working on it. My chairperson, very known name, in a 2 days UN conference in Uber last 2 days, we sat down and we worked on that plan. We want to have a national action plan, the national, what you call policy framework for the gender-based issues, gender-based violence. Now, this is why it is vital. Because political priorities in the provinces are not similar. They have different challenges, they have different ethos, different values. So what NCSW, the question was, not only we are a watchdog to look into the legal gaps and to fill that legal gaps to getting that done by the parliament. We have our interest, but it's also a enabler of knowledge production. We are doing research, but not only doing research, we are making providing an enabling environment so that that research can, play its part, and our findings can be effective to resolve the issues. So this is the very general statement I am giving, but I will tell you that the last 2 days conference, as a secretary at NCSW, I took the initiative and which was alhamdulillah, by the grace of Almighty Allah, the media has very deeply appreciated and all the house appreciated. I have introduced the concept of national integrated GBV victims helpline. But it is not only a helpline to lodge complaints. It will be backed by a web-based portal. And the women have their own password, user word, and they can see the progress of their cases there without going to the police stations, without engaging the government. So this is one initiative we have started.
So Imran sir, that is a very, very encouraging step, the integrated portal, because helpline, because a lot of cybersecurity was happening. A lot of civil society organizations had, and then there was this whole thing of technology facilitated GBV, which was not being looked into. So it's good that this is one thing that has been taken up, and very encouraging that this is the mindset that is present there at the NCSW. Do you think that despite the data collection and other actions evolved to the provinces, you still feel that a data portal, an integrated one, and the National Commission on Gender can one of the first key steps that we can take towards what you talk about in climate equity and climate justice, and also resilience that we want to build?
I think you're spot on. This was actually the Achilles heel. One province talking to other was finding difficulty not in understanding each other problems. They were finding difficulty in coordination, in collaboration, and to have a uniform hand-holding. What NCSW can do at this point in time is that unless the provinces become self-sufficient and have a robust policies, NCSW can hold to the hand-holding thing, can collaborate between the provinces and find out standard protocols. That is the most important thing. Standard protocols, easy to access, one window services, and in the same manner, when the calamity comes, we must have a standardized policies to.
That's really, really important. Thank you so much, Imran sir. Thank you for talking about this coordinated approach and also taking ownership of what the work that we can do. You have talked about the national action plan that is being developed for gender, and we would like to share the work that we have done through the gender policy review so that it can feed into that national action plan. It is on economic empowerment for women, it is on disaster resilience, because we also work on the financial inclusion with a strategy with the state bank on it and how it can be incorporated disaster resilience lens to it. So we are really grateful for that. Another recommendation that Dr. Pariha's presentation gave was an addition as an annexure or as a point to the national climate policy. And we would love to work with NCSW on that from the gender and disaster resilience. So thank you for your presence and your comments.
And last but not least, I want to thank the host, the speakers, and all the participants. I should have done it at the very outset, but I'm sorry, I was more occupied with I want to spell out my ideas first. So thank you very much. You guys are doing a wonderful job.
Thank you. And thank you so much, sir. Now, last but not the least, Ali Kamal Sab from the Ministry of Planning. He's the Chief of SDGs. And sir, even before you came and after you came, all we have talked about is SDGs and the consolidation of efforts towards having an approach to SDGs and the implementation and support women and climate action. We have talked about how these SDG 5 and SDG 13 can be clubbed together for data work and other work, and has been presented as some of our recommendations. Your thoughts on it and what does the future of this work look like?
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Few familiar faces, Isman, Sarisa Bakiajo, Jamisa, very good presentation for you, and proud of your friends. Bilal Saab, Imran Saab, usually, and Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for having me here. Basically, the work you are doing is very important in a way that we are into a disaster risk reduction strategy. For the very first day in 2015, when we signed, when we adopted Sustainable Development Goals, but still the work in progress. And after the floods, especially, there are lots of reports coming. There are lots of reports written by different organizations, that is Development Partners. I can see World Bank sitting at the back. I can see some other places who have contributed in the disaster assessment or ORF report of President, in which we have assessed the damage and the assessment of $50 million funds needed. And based on that, and thanks to UNDP as well, who guided us to went to Davos and have pledges of $11 billion. Though it is a 5 to 10 year program. Actually, every program, as we have discussed earlier, before and when we talked earlier, that every policy which is coming up as a as a part of the Congress of Pakistan, whether it's the NCSW, whether it's human rights, whether it's poverty and divisions, whether it's NDMA or climate change, gender is inbuilt. We are not specifically saying that we are doing this for gender or the vulnerable groups, but we are doing it for everyone. As Imran said, that attitude is one issue. Whether we have a policy, whether we have written something in the book or a manual or we have one, attitude is one thing which we need to change, and that is very important. That's one of the things. Coming back to the recommendation which Faria made, data repository, we have data dashboard instead. I think that will be launched.
It has launched on the data portal, but a couple of provinces are little slow. I'm pretty sure that the progress will be important.
Right. Gender Action Lab, we have already set up the gender unit in classification. We are struggling to have a gender expert over there. And when I say struggling, then that's the need for classification. That's why we have a gender expert in the last 6 months or 1 year. But we are still
Gender equality monitor, that what we will be doing in the gender portal as well. As far as the evidence-based guiding is concerned, we have all the data, but the thing is, whether we are using that data effectively or not. If there are 73,000 pregnant women who are going to deliver a baby within 6 months when the blood happens, then what should we do? What we have done? What we have done is whether we have hospitals, we have an FBA over there, there are several international organizations working over there, World Bank over there. But what we have done is we don't have that evidence for that. Maybe we have done a lot. Maybe we have done very bad thing over there, but we do not have the evidence. So we need to first have the evidence and the data portal or some other portal so that we can have it. And that's one of the good recommendations which you said now very clearly. As far as the care economy and the wage gap is concerned, so care economy is the one where we are supporting our women at the household level, but we need to do a lot as far as the climate is concerned or floods are concerned, and especially in the rural areas. Right now, sitting in Islamabad, in a very good hotel, we can say that women are doing wonders at home as a care economy, whether they're working, whether they're not working in the field. But this is Islamabad. And we used to hear, and it's so true, that Islamabad is 20 kilometers away from Pakistan. And that's one of the problems we are facing. And that's what we are hearing, what we used to hear in the East, and it's still true. Women mobility is concerned of God has got up. I think he's the best man to say about the transport thing. We need to break the norm. As believe me, we had a midterm review going on of SDGs, and yesterday we had on the poverty inequality. Today it was cancelled, and that's why I'm here. So otherwise I will be moderating the session over there. Tomorrow we are going to have it on the health, which is the core subject of women or gender or vulnerable group, you can call it. In those all the consultations which we are going to have in the next 2 weeks, we are talking explicitly on gender, vulnerable groups, and including other goals, which is education, health, economic growth, participation, decent work, inequality, consumption, governance. Every aspect has gender included. So you are more than welcome to join us. So I'm very thankful to you and the such a good exercise and international speakers carrying it without you have done good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisa. And this actually yes, and I would also after this want to open the house for questions or comments. So yes.
One street. I think one very important point we have not yet discussed, that is digitalization. We have to bridge the gap, the digital gap, which is actually it's a serious issue in our.
Yes, the gender digital divide is very real in Pakistan.
Second,
yes.
What you started is advocacy lab in NCSW with one of the telecom partners.
Yeah.
Inshallah, we'll be launching it just for this how to take measures.
So that also they listen to the financial inclusion and digitalization work that we have been recommending. So thank you for that, and we will be talking more on that in a separate session. Yes, thank you.
I just wanted to quickly respond to give some assurances. Obviously, so the government counterparts and our clients in this case include disparities are obviously are correcting. When Meena and Vilasa also mentioned that maybe measuring the impact of our interventions is something that is very important, and that is something that is already inbuilt in our system. For example, we have annual review for our programs, we have project completion reports, and then we have our National Audit Office, which picks certain programs and they undertake audits, and this is an ongoing process. Case of payment, we have Mali inbuilt in this design, which is coming September this year at the midpoint, so that we can learn lessons from it to make improvements. And obviously, your feedback, government counterparts' feedback is the most important thing for us. And today's session is actually aimed at getting that feedback not only at the time of delivery, but also at the time of design, visualizing. Another thing that was very rightly pointed out was probably gender is not just important in climate. We have a macroeconomic reform program, and gender is something that is the most important and is the smartest way to achieve the ambition that the program sets out for itself. So we are not only talking to people who are relevant to climate. Lalai is also still mentioned. They are working on the financial inclusion strategy of State Bank of Pakistan. They are working with Meta. It cuts across all the themes. And finally, I have a suggestion to make way forward for the program. As you very rightly pointed out, data is something that we can base our interventions on. And availability of gender disaggregated data or non-availability of it is a major critical factor in achieving the ambition that we and you share. So our support is not only collecting that data, but also using that data for evidence-based. Obviously, the offer is.
Thank you. And now, if anybody from the experts that we have invited today have any comments of the work that we are doing, or if there is any partnerships that we can have, or any consolidation of efforts that we've been talking about, so the house is open for comments or questions, or even new ideas that we can take up. Everybody has slides, but I still, yeah. So you want to start? Okay. Okay.
Hi. So I have a very specific question. First of all, thank you very much for inviting this session. You know, we all, I believe, have some opportunity every now and then to propose specific interventions. And given, the space that has been discussed today, what is like the most important specific intervention that one should suggest, in all those different forms? I've understood digitalization is important, I've understood all these things, but what would be like one of that, so that we can start talking about it before it goes. The other question is actually for the planning commission. I believe there is a Pakistan Living Standards Measurement Survey. So I used it once for my college research, many times. There was an indicator for human power. And when I analyzed it, it was it showed that women are far more empowered than men. So I mean there is data. I just don't know why that data set is not used. Because I actually used it quite extensively for my own college research, but I don't know why it's not being used now.
I agree with it metaphorically.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for making me part of this group that is discussing the very valuable work done by STPI in collaboration with FCTO Remit. I was going to start with the data issue, and I'm glad Saad, you pointed it out. I don't know which round of PSLM provided the evidence that women are very empowered. I would really love to see your paper on that. However, my point is that national level data sets do exist. What we have to do is we have to fortify them with additional modules to specifically elicit information about disaster risk resilience and disaster risk management. This is how it is done over the world, because you don't have the money to carry out customized surveys post disasters. So you need to build in those modules and collect data on a regular basis, which would then enable you to develop the DRR, DRM, and DRF. I'm sure everyone knows these acronyms by now, policies. And secondly, I would say that there is a lot of specialized literature on how social protection needs to be adapted to disaster risk resilience and disaster risk management. I'm sorry to say, but at the moment, the social protection landscape in Pakistan is again very, very focused on cash transfers, and both conditional and unconditional cash transfers. I think we need to broaden the ambit of social protection, because in the end, those are the vehicles through which aid is channelized, whether it is international aid or local philanthropy, and that needs to be done. What I'm going to end up by saying is that when we talk of collaboration, I don't understand why we leave out the vast work done by the rural support programs of Pakistan, because we are talking basically of impacts in rural areas mostly. I mean, climate does affect the gender equality perspectives in urban areas also, but we need another lens, more focused lens for that. When we talk of community level efforts, rural support programs have done a lot of work on social mobilization and community networks. Why don't we think of harnessing all that work and all that soft sort of infrastructure that has been developed? So I would strongly recommend to have a look over that body of work and try to use your community level initiatives in that perspective. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, especially the community part, because they're the first line of the support that the community gets from immediately. So anybody else? I mean, I would like somebody to talk about the provincial and the national coordination mechanisms and even at the local governments. So anybody who would want to talk about the solution to that and how we can be moving towards consolidation of small efforts? Or is what Imran Saab suggested, a hand-holding by the NCSW in the beginning and then moving to the provincial?
I just have to make a comment that NDMA is working towards that. They have the current chairman is setting up the NOC, that is the National Emergency Operations Center, state-of-the-art operations center in the ERA building. And we would have experts sitting over there with real-time data coming in from NASA and other international, from SPARKLE, from PMB, from everywhere. And we will be having the National Gender Data Portal access of UN Women, the UNOCHA the dashboard, and we will have all the data on gender, GBV, SRH, all the data over there coming in real time, so that we can prepare for disaster mitigation plans before a disaster occurs. So we have a plan with that, and all our partners are on board with that. So coming to you, sir, can your data portal be integrated into our NOC?
Yes, it can. We can integrate the APIs, and it is good. It is good.
Okay, because we are working towards disaster mitigation now.
Yes, I think it's a good idea. I will discuss it.
And thank you. A good positive outcome for at least one good thing that we can see. Anything, anybody else who wants to?
Assalamu alaikum ji, I'm from Boston Poverty Alleviation Fund. I would just like to share that we have recently launched a housing project in the 2 districts of Tufwa, and where we are working for resilient housing as well as providing capacity building to the women as well as the men. I just had a comment that I think there's a time that since everybody is here and we are talking about individual efforts that we have been doing, but it's time to synergize our efforts. We need to come together. We need to share the work we are doing, maybe on any of the national level portal or within the organizations that are working here. But I find that this could be a good solution to take forward our efforts and have a meaningful outcomes.
Yeah, thank you. And my request to NTA may be that probably when you roll out this initiative, communicate it more widely so that anybody who is working on it, everybody should be a part of it.
I would like to add to that. NDMA is holding a national level expo on disaster mitigation, building the resilient Pakistan in the first week of July, and all stakeholders, all the organization, all NGOs, private philanthropists working in the disaster sector would be invited to that, and they would be able to have stalls over there and conferences, and so everybody, it would be a coordinated effort.
That's great. That's really good to know. So if we have no more comments or questions.
I just wanted to raise that we're under living in this, we're doing a human adaptation fund proposal. So if you have any suggestions or interventions that would propose, now is a good time. It's focused on water very much, and it's being led by UNICEF.
I think first question raised, I just want to give a quick answer to it. What we can suggest at one as a Pakistan, not as a second place system. What we have seen is there are 5 major calamities, which are the floods, and rice said that just not 16 months. But what we have seen is that we were never ready. And once this happened, then after 4 or 5 days, we see the whole Pakistan converging to many people, right? There are scenes which really excite you and make you proud to be Pakistan. But as somebody said, why can't we pool it? That is not the time to pool your resources, your energies or your plans. Time is today. What we need today is that not only the government, not only the provincial sectors, not only the local governments, but also the donors and also NGOs, charity organizations, philanthropists, and also the companies. We must pool and make mechanisms so that when, God forbid, disaster comes, we have those financial pockets available, data shared, and how to do it should be. I'll speak to the planning commission is here. I think we all can sit together and have a session on this part. If we can do, I can assure you that I don't know. I can just say that we will not be needing any one day for that. We should not be knocking the doors and taking that very on to the place to help us out. The country is there and people are there.
I think a very good. No, it's still good to see that there is a commitment from the side of the government to be able to sit together and consolidate all the efforts, because so much is happening. Everybody is working with gender, including the donors.
But we need to see impact and results at the end of the day, and also probably a repository of knowledge and some mechanism of institutionalizing all that knowledge which is missing. So we need to do that. We're already doing a donor coordination. I'm talking about Remit. A donor coordination mechanism is setting up for the revenue mobilization work that we do. So probably doing that for climate action and gender is also on the cards, and we will definitely be getting in touch with everyone. I really want to thank everyone for today, and just last 2 minutes, Usman Khan, I want to invite, who is the investment lead for the project, Remit, for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Murali, and thank you everyone for participating and being here. My special thanks to our panel here, Bilal Saab, Ram Saab. Thank you for supporting us always, leading from the front, Dr. Bakar, for helping us with this extraordinary work. Just a couple of comments before I close and listening to the session. And I think the points that I would like to raise is first, there is this weakness that we look at when we talk about these policy documents and the work that we're doing. We normally look at policy in very isolated circles. So we're not really, the policy between sectors is not really talking. And that relates to, there was a question on data as well. And I think as a researcher as well, my issue with data is not the availability to that, more of the binary nature of the data that we have in PSLM. So when I look at mix of PSLM, it does give me, let's say, access to schools or access to this, but it's a binary number. The qualitative part of the insight of that data is really missing. And I think that's the bigger part in terms of why there is policy isolation that I see happening. The third part, I think, which came in the discussion is also when we talk about especially gender and disaster, it's also about our behaviors, how the policy and the actions actually impact those behaviors, where using those behaviors we're able to actually control these impacts of disasters. I think that's an important point. Which also sort of some of the recommendations that were in Dr. Priya's presentation actually touched upon that. There's one piece of work that Remit is also doing, which is looking at, like you mentioned earlier, we have a broader, more macroeconomic aspect. We're looking at indigenous sectors of the economy and how those can be supported. That is really important because that really strengthens the economic fabric at a very local level, which is really important for building resilience. We are providing technical assistance and, when we talk about housing and infrastructure, all of that, but it is actually the economic resilience that really sort of supports, how disasters are met. And I think COVID has been a good success story where, our immediate social protection action that went in, which really meant that people could afford to stay at home, was really in essence, that really helped us reduce the disease burden. So I think even with all the other, especially the natural disasters, also if we build that economic fabric at the local level, the resilience would come from that. And finally, my last point on SDGs. And I think again, SDGs, we keep hearing about the deficit of funding, and that will always remain, right? So it's not about the gaps that we have. It's always good to identify that, but I think it is also doing the best of what we already have. I think that links to the point of how we do this as an integrated effort, especially not just at the public sector level, but as achieving SDGs is a lot to do with how society comes together as well, and actually take a collective action. It's not just whole of government; it's actually whole of nation approach to achieving that. And some of the questions raised here on coordination, so Remit also has an economy for all group, which we've established as an experimental intervention where we try to bring people working on different aspects of economy and related topics. And we've had one session 3 months ago. And you have our details to anyone who wants to be part of that group. It's a fairly open group, and we then hold these sessions every 3 to 4 months, and we have a substantive agenda to discuss. We also bring our own interventions in that group as well. So, Bilal, we mentioned in terms of how we look at impact, so there are different ways. So we open up what we're doing to this open group and as a sounding board, and we take open feedback and critique in terms of how we can actually improve our intervention. Some of this particular piece of work actually came as part of that activity as well. So I'll stop there and thank you again everyone for attending this and making this a good session. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you everyone and thank you to our panelists and everyone.
Yes, please join us for lunch.